Welcome. The Interagency Council of Norristown, ICN, is a consortium of organizations and individuals concerned with improving the quality of life and delivery of human services within the greater central Montgomery County. We bring people together in the region to promote collaboration and cooperation among social service organizations, community groups, local government, and residents. Through this show, ICN Presents Making Connections will consider a variety of topics that will identify community resources and needs and will discuss quality of life issues. We'll talk about strategies for strengthening our families, healthy lifestyle choices, and volunteer options. We hope that you find this show informative and helpful. Today's show, we're going to be talking about after-school programs and how after-school programs help shape young people into achieving the goals that they've set for themselves, both academically, socially, and emotionally. We hope you find this show informative and interesting.
Welcome. I'm glad that you're here with us today. We're going to talk about things that are pretty important, I think, for students and their families, for student success. We often think about children being successful in school because they do well in their classes and kind of focus on the academics. But we know that it's more than academics. It's more than classroom time. Although teachers are providing valuable resources to students, there are other things that affect student achievement. Things like parental involvement. We know that's really critical. We know that academic supports like tutoring, after-school programs can be very supportive. We also know that in our communities, stressful neighborhoods or stressful families or ill health with the students or with their families, those things can have negative impacts. So I wanted to learn more about the work that you're doing today, and so I'd like to introduce you and then find out more about the work that you're conducting. Kelly Brown is with Family Services, and you're a core management team member or board member of the Safe Schools Healthy Students Initiative here at Norristown Area School District.
That's right.
And that's made up of community representatives and school folks. And you'll tell us more about that. And then Andrea Lacey is the coordinator of the Norristown Area School District 21st Century Community Learning Centers. And so I'm eager to learn more about both of the programs and services, the array of services that are available. So tell me more about how does the Healthy Students, Safe Students Initiative, and then later the 21st Century Learning Centers really address, help build protective factors in youth, help increase their resiliency, and improve opportunities for students to graduate from high school, and also kind of grow into healthy relationships in their life, be productive citizens and so on. So Kelly, tell me a little bit about that.
Really, and throughout this morning, you're going to hear us talk a lot about risk factors and protective factors. So I think just so people understand what we mean, risk factors, we're really looking at those characteristics, those things that are impacting a child that increase their risk for becoming involved in antisocial behavior in adolescence, things like drug use and violence and delinquency and teen pregnancy. So when we talk about risk factors, we're talking about those things that increase a child's chances of becoming involved in problem behavior.
So like what would be a risk factor that does increase that chance?
A risk factor would be things like truancy. It's definitely a risk factor for school dropout. Truancy is also a risk factor for juvenile delinquency and substance abuse, because we know that when kids are home during the day with time on their hands, they're getting involved in things that they otherwise shouldn't. Okay. So that's what the whole goal is, to then build that protective factor, which are those things that will then decrease the risk factors to make the chances for success increase for that particular child. So a protective factor is getting them back in school, getting them involved, getting them involved in the community, things like the Police Athletic League and some of the after-school programs, tutoring, just as you mentioned. They are all protective factors because they're going to help that child build resiliency and hopefully not become involved in problem behavior.
Okay. Now, one of the things I've heard about resiliency, an easy definition, is kind of bouncing back.
Absolutely.
Having the strength and the capacity to experience maybe a risk factor of some kind or a negative activity, a negative experience, but then be able to say, okay, well, I'm redirecting myself. I will be successful. And surrounding students, I guess, then with some of these protective factors helps
Absolutely.
to build that.
And risk factors are different for every child, every family, and we'll talk about that, I think, later on this morning, that risk factors look different depending on the community, depending on the family, depending on the child. So a risk factor for one child might be poverty, where for another child in another affluent neighborhood, poverty may not be their risk factor, but it might be something like depression, or
Okay.
maybe there's some turbulence in the family. So risk factors are going to vary, but every child is impacted by some kind of risk factor or another,
Okay.
whether it's within their character or outside of them,
Okay.
whether it's
good.
external or internal. But the Safe Schools Healthy Students Grant was originally developed and adopted to address multiple risk factors. So with Safe Schools Healthy Students Grant, when the school district and the community partners developed the grant, we were really looking at things like delinquency, truancy, safety, violence, drug use, and putting a bunch of programs and services in place and supports for students and their families in place in order to decrease the incidence of those problem behaviors. And we could talk a little more about specific services, I guess, in a little bit, but Andy,
Yeah,
I
let's
don't know.
hear a little bit about 21st
Well, with the
century.
21st century, the reason that we wrote the grant here in our district was simply because we looked at the district and we know that we have a very diverse and at-risk population, and some of those risk factors included that in the grant that we wrote, that we had an increase at the time in 2007 when the grant was originally written, an increase in the minority, the disadvantaged, the non-English speaking students, the poverty rate had increased. It's one of the highest in the entire county for Norristown. And also the Norristown area also has one of the largest populations of people receiving public assistance. And with that, we noticed that we had about 60% of our students on free reduced lunch. So with those factors in mind, we see that parents were struggling to find the resources that they needed in order to survive. Healthcare, decent housing, employment. The employment rate was one of the risk factors as well. For Norristown, it had increased to, I think it was 4.7% compared to the state rate, which was 3.5%. So we were
And
above
this was
that.
a couple years
This
ago.
was a couple years
Right.
ago. And so with that in mind, the 21st Century Grant, that's where that came into play.
Okay.
And the purpose of the grant, or the goal, is to help and assist those students in meeting the state standards in reading and mathematics by providing an academic enrichment program.
Okay, so it is very targeted then at the academic enrichment,
Yes.
and it's predominantly for students who are not making those standards right
who are
now.
not meeting proficiency levels in the
Okay.
PSSAs.
And so they get extra
They-
supports and
they-
different ways of learning the things they need to learn.
Yes, they get reading and math support in 21st century. They get both subjects to reinforce. But in addition, with the 21st century, what's unique about it compared to regular after-school programs, there's an additional piece where the students are exposed to activities where, perhaps they might not have those opportunities to be involved in. Things like character education, drug and violence prevention, technology education, career exploration, service learning projects,
Right.
just simple
Oh, that's
recreation
nice. Yeah.
activities. So they have those opportunities that we're providing to them so that they have a chance to have experiences.